Tonight's program is entitled Civil Rights in the 104th Congress. This evening, we try to see what the future may hold for civil rights, both in this country and right here in Boston. The new Republican Congress is poised to cut back federal civil rights policies and programs or to eliminate them entirely. Powerful congressional caucuses, such as the Black Caucus, often raising important civil rights questions in the legislative process, will lose a significant amount of their funding through Republican-mandated budget cuts. We look now tonight to see what this will mean for the future of civil rights legislation. Joining us this evening is United States Congressman Barney Frank. In his 8 terms in the United States House of Representatives, Congressman Frank has been an outspoken advocate of civil rights. Since the Republican majority took over the House of Representatives in January, Congressman Frank has been a vocal critic of Republican leadership and also a critic of many aspects of the so-called contract with America. Joining us tonight as well is Massachusetts State Senator Dianne Wilkerson. Senator Wilkerson is the first African-American woman to serve as a state senator in Massachusetts. She is a single mother of 2 and has worked her way through college and law school and had become a partner at a major Boston law firm. Senator Wilkerson has achieved great career strides in a world she admits is not always friendly to people of color and women. Senator Wilkerson has established a reputation for being able to make tough and sometimes unpopular decisions, including a recent difficult battle with Governor Weld over welfare reform. Our third panelist this evening is David Hall, Dean of the Northeastern University School of Law. He has been a member of the faculty since 1985, and 2 years ago was appointed Dean of the Northeastern University School of Law. Dean Hall is the first African American to head a law school in the Boston area. He has taught in the area of civil rights, and his publications include works on civil rights as well. I ask you to welcome our guest speakers tonight, Congressman Frank, Senator Wilkerson, and Dean Hall.
The most significant fact in American politics today, I think, and it's one that's directly relevant to this topic, was probably best highlighted if you read yesterday's New York Times or other newspapers, which reported the pledge by Senator Robert Dole to repeal the ban on assault weapons. It's kind of an odd thing for a person who wants to be president to talk about this way, since it's clear to most people that a large majority of the country prefers to have the ban on assault weapons. But what it indicates is what is the central dynamic political fact in America today, given the control of Congress, and that's the strength of very, very conservative Republicans within their party. You're going to see over the next year or so a series of successful efforts by Phil Gramm to yank Bob Dole to the right. Actually, there won't be successful efforts. Gramm will try to attack Dole for being dangerously moderate within the Republican Party, and Dole will respond by indignantly denying that he is a moderate and move to the right. I say that because that's the context for civil rights legislation. Clearly, it was to be expected last November when conservative Republicans won both houses that our prospects of any additional civil rights legislation would be nil. We had recently not just enacted civil rights legislation, not just sort of improved on existing civil rights legislation, but also try to expand its reach. I think one of the many useful ways to look at the American history is to look at the Constitution, a marvelous document, really an extraordinary document for its time, but one which was very imperfectly realized from the moment of its adoption. It set forward some wonderful universal principles and gave the benefit of them, on the whole, to rich white Protestant men. Other groups were in varying degrees included. Some were completely excluded. And we've had a series of efforts over the course of our history to give other people the full benefit of those rights. What we've done in the civil rights area in the last couple of years has been, first, with regard to the traditional civil rights of racial minorities, improve the remedies that are available, including punitive damages. Secondly, we have expanded the reach of those rights. The Americans with Disabilities Act was one example. In fact, of all the civil rights acts we have passed recently, the Americans with Disabilities Act probably has the broadest reach in terms of the federal government telling people how they're going to run retail stores, residential buildings, etc. Last year, with the support of the Civil Rights Leadership Conference, we launched the effort at the national level in a serious way. There had been kind of flag waving in that regard, but we launched the effort in a serious way to bring gay men and lesbians within the anti-job discrimination protections of the Constitution, and that was explicitly an effort by the civil rights community, the Civil Rights Leadership Conference, with Coretta King and Ralph Nees, the executive director of the conference, in attendance, to expand that. But now we find ourselves in a very different situation. Because of the conservative Republican hold on Congress, what you are going to see is not only no expansion of these rights, but an effort to cut them back. And it is a very dangerous effort for a couple of reasons. First of all, we have in this country a significant uneasiness on the part of a lot of people who find that they are facing economic insecurity contrary to what they had been told to expect. Americans in the post-war period have grown up believing that even if you weren't very highly educated or skilled, if you were willing to work hard, if you were willing to go to work every day and do the job, your economic future would be pretty secure. You wouldn't be rich, but you would have that stability and some increase. That was particularly true for people who didn't have to worry about discrimination. That is, if you were a racial minority, you didn't necessarily feel that way. And women had a different set of expectations. But white men generally, and increasingly other groups, came to believe that. Over the last 10 years or so, that's been changed. It's been changed by technology. It's been changed by international integration economically. We have had people now uncertain. And what we've got in politics today in America is a competition to explain to people who now feel that no matter how hard they work, they can't have the economic security that they thought they would have. People who feel victimized, people who feel victimized by international trade, by technology, by a whole lot of things which are in fact in the overall interest of the country, but which can have negative short-term effects on some people. And there clearly are some short-term dislocative effects on some people from things that are in our overall best interest. And while they are short-term, if you're 52 years old and not highly skilled, the short term is the rest of your working life. And telling people that in the long term these are going to be good for everybody is not always persuasive, because the average citizen in that situation may not know that John Maynard Keynes is the one who said it, but he understands the wisdom of what Keynes said. In the long run, we'll all be dead. And in the short run, people are worried. What the Republicans are doing is, in my judgment, a problem because, look, there have always been people who are critical of civil rights legislation, always been people who are willing to scapegoat minorities. Some of these arguments are now more plausible, and the question is why. And I think people understand that there is this feeling of insecurity among a large number of working Americans. One of the most fascinating things for political analysts to figure out is why the Republicans did so well in 1994 despite how well the economy had been doing. The American economy in 1993 and 1994 performed extraordinarily well by historical standards. We had greater growth than at any time since 84, 85 under Ronald Reagan, and that growth was accompanied by great increases in the deficit, a very stimulative, although ultimately problematic result. In 93 and 94, we had very significant economic growth, very little inflation, great job creation, while the deficit was going down. All of the normal rules would have predicted 94 would have been a better than average year for the Democrats as the party in power. In fact, it was a disastrous one. And I think it has to do with the economic uncertainty people feel, with the change in the nature of work. It's a transitional period, and the old rules don't apply. What Newt Gingrich understands is that there is a phenomenon in search of an explanation. And the explanation that the right wing of the Republican Party is giving working people is that black people and women and immigrants and poor people are taking away their jobs. That is implausible. Interestingly, George Will today, the poor people are doing it, they say, because we're spending so much on them that there's not enough left in the economy for you to have jobs. As George Will points out essentially today, the notion that it is the poor people's fault that other people don't have enough income is inherently flawed for one reason. The overwhelming characteristic of poor people is that they do not have a great deal of money. And if, in fact, you were to take away all the money the poor people have, you wouldn't be making anybody else very rich. There's not a great pool there. I mean, that's a basic fact, but you read George Will today, and what he says is if you want to reform welfare, if you want to do it in a serious way, it's going to mean more government involvement and more spending in the short term. And it was a very intellectually honest column by George Will. But they blame poor people. They blame immigrants. They say the immigrants are taking your jobs away. The poor people are causing taxes to be too high and money to be spent too profligately. And they say women and blacks are taking away your jobs. In fact, that simply isn't true. It is not the case that Americans who could 30 years ago expect to leave high school and go to work in a factory and make a very decent wage and put together a good family life, etc. They haven't lost those jobs because women have now moved into the automobile factories, or that black people have taken over as rubber workers. The problem is the nature of work is changing. International economic integration and other factors are in there. We have to deal with those. And I think this is the main problem that I and other Democrats have to deal with, is how do you deal with the short-term, intermediate-term effects? One of the things that people, I think, have been unwilling to acknowledge, The Economist, the British magazine The Economist, did it in October. Things in the international economic area that are in the long-term interest can have short-term negative effects on working people. They don't have a uniformly good effect within the country. Remember, the theory that justifies international trade is a theory of comparative advantage, which says that each country will do what it does best. These days, what we will do best is likely to benefit the more educated, the more skilled, the people who work with more capital. What other countries will do best will be to the detriment of some of the people in our country who have been able to make a good living unskilled. That doesn't mean you stop it. It does mean you understand that and try and deal with it. But what I'm trying to get across is why this assault on fairness in the racial area and in the gender area has more appeal today than it had. If you want that, go again to Bob Dole. Bob Dole, with regard to affirmative action, is completely repudiating things he said 10 years ago. When there was an assault on affirmative action during the Reagan years, Bob Dole went to its defense. He is now joining in the criticism of it. Let's be clear, it is a criticism that, in the first place, gives it credit for phenomena far beyond what it has accomplished. For one thing, as anybody who has worked in the civil rights field or the affirmative action field understands, it's a very uphill fight. The successes are far fewer than people think. We do not over-enforce civil rights laws in this country. It is very hard to prove discrimination. The general experience is that they are under-enforced. And the notion that civil rights laws and affirmative action policies are responsible for any significant percentage of employment figures gives the advocates of that more credit than they deserve, in the sense of that's just not where the statistics have been. We haven't been that successful in trying to deal with past prejudices. It also greatly distorts what affirmative action is. In fact, affirmative action is generally distinct from quotas. Goals and timetables are distinct from quotas. Quotas at the federal level have existed only in those very small number of cases where courts have found that there was official segregation, where you couldn't do certain things. And people have these convenient memories and want to forget. One of the things that I think is the most interesting point is Isaac Fullwood, who retired a year or two ago, maybe 2 years ago, as chief of police of the District of Columbia. Chief Fullwood started out as a cop 30 years ago in Washington, D.C. And when he started as a cop, or 40 years ago, when he started as a cop in Washington, D.C. as a black man, he was not allowed to ride a patrol car because black police officers were only allowed to walk the beats. They weren't allowed to ride in cars. That was in America's capital in the lifetime, the working lifetime of a man who just quit as police chief of Washington. There was this effort to forget all that. What we have then is a distortion of what affirmative action in particular means, because it is transmogrified into always being a rigid quota system, which it almost never is. It is a recognition that this is a society in which prejudice against people based on their skin color and on their gender have been very deeply rooted in our culture and in our economy, and an effort to overcome those things. And it isn't always done well. One of the things the right wing has done very successfully that we have to combat is they have learned how to use horror stories, and they talk about the horror stories. We never talk about the successes, and the few horror stories come to be taken as the norm. We should admit that people make mistakes. That is true. There have been things done in the name of affirmative action that are very stupid. There have been things done in the name of every worthwhile principle I can think of that have been very stupid. We should be willing to repudiate those, but stick with the core. And the core is that this is a society which, in 1954, first decided that racial segregation was unconstitutional. That has taken a very long time to eradicate that. It's a society in which gender equality is also a relatively new thing, and people still resist it. It is a society in which discrimination against other groups is still legally protected in some cases and the norm in others. And we continue to need the effort as a decent group of people to extend to everybody those fundamental principles of the Constitution. But the dynamic has shifted very rapidly. The dynamic now is that the element in the Republican Party, they're not the majority by any means in the country, they're probably not the majority in the Republican Party, but they're the majority of people who are politically active. The people who decide who gets nominated in the Republican Party are the people to whom Bob Dole is now responding. And so when you see him decide that repealing the ban on assault weapons is a good idea, and repudiating his prior views on affirmative action, you see what's going on. The problem is, as I say, there is within the public a substantial number of people who are looking for an explanation. They want to know why, when they read about how good the economic statistics were, they got laid off. Or the boss said, listen, you'll accept a wage freeze or we'll move the hell out of the country. Or for other reasons, they feel that they are economically insecure when they weren't supposed to be, when they did everything that they were told they had to do to live a decent life, and it's not there for them. Now, I think there are other causes, obviously, and there are other ways we have to respond. But we have to fight this as a two-front war. Yes, it is important to reaffirm that we are a country which has suffered historically from a terrible racism. Slavery is, after all, pretty tough. And we continue to have prejudices that we want to fight to eradicate so that everybody truly is treated equally. And yes, the goal is to get rid of all of these trappings of affirmative action and goals and timetables. Our view, many of us, is that we are not yet at this level of society where prejudice is so much less than it used to be that we can forget all about it, that we can't act as if there is no prejudice when there is still some around. We have to be sensible about it. We look at it. We look at the best ways to deal with it. But while we do that, we also, I believe, have to understand what the problems are that many working and middle-income people are responding to. And it won't do, as a political strategy, simply to say to people, shame on you, don't you realize we're still prejudiced, we got to be better. We have to reassert the moral case for an active set of policies that try to deal with prejudice. But we also, if we're going to have success there, need to give people the alternative and I think accurate explanation for why there is that economic uncertainty. And we will get back to this in the question period.
Good evening. I would like to start by saying that it is a real pleasure to be here. I have sat on panels with Congressman Frank before, and we decided in the back he would go first because he lives in this place that we're going to talk about called our Congress. And we are here tonight to talk about the future of civil rights in the 104th Congress. And some of the questions that I suspect you will ask and that were raised by Congressman Frank, I have my own theory about it, a theory that I see played out all across this city, and certainly in our ability to touch the news of cities and towns all over this country will allow us to make some conclusions and draw some conclusions about what else is going on. But I want to start by talking a little bit about what happened in last fall, and I think we'll talk a little bit about what I think is going on now. But remember the refrain that we heard last fall, and that was that people wanted change. You know, any politician that you ask why what they were taking, whatever position they would take, they say because the people want change. The people want change. And that refrain was really heard by politicians and candidates and would-be politicians all across the country. Whether the kind of change that the 104th Congress has embarked upon is what American people had in mind, I think remains to be seen, and I don't think we'll know for sure until the election in '96 whether they interpreted that refrain for change in the right way. What the 104th Congress will do, however, and its effect on civil rights is something that I think we've already begun to see. For purposes of my comments, the term civil rights is something that is meant, or intended at least in my comments, to mean something more than what happened in the 60s, more than the civil rights movement, but rather a discussion of the question of not only how African Americans will be treated and will fare in this country, but more broadly the civil rights of all of those people who are targeted and all of those people who are historically disadvantaged or separated from the opportunities accorded to a few in this country. The new Congress, or the Newt Congress, however you want to interpret it, has as its operational framework, at least, this document called the Contract with America. And it is a new document, and I constantly refer to it as a new document because we already had an existing contract with America, and we generally referred to it as the Constitution of the United States. And while no formal repeal has taken place, it must be crystal clear that the impact of a successful adoption of even a part of the Contract with America will have a direct and an indirect impact on the Constitution and the civil rights of people that live in this country, and the individuals that live in this country in ways that we have never known. And lest I get too far into this discussion before I make the point, let me say now that for me to discuss the 104th Congress in the context of partisan politics would be a mistake, because I do not believe that this is necessarily about Republicans versus Democrats. And I think that some of the numbers and the votes that have already been taken by this new Congress will bear that out. And while the Republicans clearly are in the majority of the votes that have been taken by this new Congress accounts for adoption of bills that represent more than just the number of Republicans. So there clearly are a lot of Democrats that are adopting or voting and supporting the new contract. The widening of the gap, I think, and one of the biggest gulfs that we see is not necessarily one on the political level that's being had based on a fight between Republicans and Democrats, but it's a growing gulf that's based on gender. I think gender, class, and race. And if you look at it that way, I think it starts to explain some of the things that Congressman Frank talked about. the actions of this new Congress will touch the individual civil rights of people that we've never experienced before. And one of the reasons why I think people have been so slow to respond to what is going on is because people generally don't see what happens on a day-to-day basis in Washington and the actions of their federal government as something that impacts them and touches them individually on a day-to-day basis. And that was really until now. We've never had, I think, more distance between individuals and their federal government, and that clearly is all changing, because we're going to get to know what it is to feel the impact of votes and decisions that are taken in Washington on a very, very personal basis. And to recharacterize and refocus the discussion away from party politics to one of gender, class, and race, I think allows us to clearly appreciate the potential impact of what is happening. We speak in generalizations often because there's no other way to do that, and I don't like to generalize, but there are some generalizations that I will make for purposes of this comment. And first is that, generally speaking, there is, I believe, a very loud, vocal minority of scared, angry, greedy, and threatened white men. And they're not angry about what is happening, but I think they're afraid of what they think is going to happen. And one of the ways to explain what Congressman Frank talked about when that we're talking about the impact of affirmative action, how it's undone and basically substituted people of color and women for rights and places and jobs across this country that really belong to others, is simply and totally defied by fact. If you saw the Boston Globe on Friday, they had a list of basically every institution in this city, banking, insurance, education, medicine, health, and what the statistics, I mean the pure numbers and facts show, and that in every one of those categories, white males have had a significant increase in employment opportunities, and the largest decrease in employees across all of those institutions have been African Americans, and the second have been Hispanics. And you have to wonder then, how does this square with this notion that we are replacing and displacing white men? And part of the answer to me is that it is just that they know it's not true, but that they fear that that may be true, and that there is very little that one can do to stem this tide of the browning of America. And it's happening. And so one of the ways you do it is you convince people that they somehow are being displaced and short-sighted, short-changed, and they bought it. But one of the reasons why they were able to buy this message from a relatively small and local, vocal minority group of men who have taken over the airwaves all across this country is because at the same time we've had a very silent majority of not so scared and not so angry white men and white women and people of color and people who live in this country. And what's happened in that situation is that they've allowed this vocal minority to the views to take over and represent and become representative of the majority opinion, or at least the majority situation, and it clearly isn't the case. But if that's the only discussion that we're having, and that's the only message, and they have been incredibly and extraordinarily effective in that message. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to watch or read any of the stories about the Republicans' ascendancy to the takeover of Congress, and they talked about the total obsession with fax machines and how they had put in place communication networks so that they were distributing the same kind of information on a daily basis to fax machines all over this country, but it was constant. And the one thing that clearly that they had that most of us did not have was a plan and a strategy. And they also had many Democrats, and the only reference I would make to Democrats, because I said I don't believe this is a party issue, who understood that some of the policies that the congressman talked about had not necessarily worked in the way we intended. Some of them had failed and couldn't figure out any way to change what we were doing. and to acknowledge that we had made some mistakes. And so in the process, what has happened is that we have been adopting this policy, a wholesale policy of a phrase, reminds me of something that I used to hear all the time, and that is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And because welfare didn't work, we basically restructured the whole system in a way that we decided that what was wrong with the people who were on it. So what was wrong with the welfare system was that it had too many poor people in it. And what is wrong with affirmative action, we would now like to convince ourselves. You know, what is wrong with the military is that we had all of these gay and lesbians who somehow were like destroying the whole fabric of our military. And that is the mentality that is taken over, that scaring people works. It works especially when you don't have someone with an alternative plan to tell people the truth in the way that makes sense. And that is much of what we've been experiencing. The other thing that is happening is I talked about this whole notion of, I think that there is a reality, and they do understand that much of what we're talking about fixing is something that isn't broken, but it is not a response to what we are doing today. It is not a response. What happened in the fall was not a response to the lot and the situation of so many of the what I call the angry minority, but in fact a response to where they think we're going and the significance of what happened in South Africa and the fear in this country that that's going to happen to us. Us meaning that those of us who used to be in control, so that much of what we're discussing is about a way to stem that tide. And believe me, this discussion about choice and how it impacts women and this rush to decrease the number of opportunities and options that women have has all to do with the same story, that we have to make it more difficult for women. We have to make it more difficult for women to get abortions because we want them to continue to produce. And that's part of what I think is hidden, and we have to talk about that because I think if we at least acknowledge that, we'll figure out why, when most of us know that all the things we've been told are happening, it's not really true. It isn't true. The biggest beneficiaries, for example, of the entire civil rights movement were and are, to this day, white women. And when I think about what's happening, it reminds me of the vision of the rabbit that's kind of frozen in front of the headlights and didn't know what to do. And that's exactly what happened in the whole discussion, which went on for 3 years about welfare reform, is that the very group of people that you would think would be there and would be active in this discussion about what's happening were silent. And what was done was that we were allowed as a country to be put on the defensive, because so many people, and particularly politicians across this country, hit a resonant chord when they tried to convince everyone that, in fact, putting a black face on welfare reform allowed people to do all of the things that were done. And if there is one admonition that I have, it's about this new debate and discussion that is blown onto the forefront of this discussion, and that is affirmative action. And that if, in fact, the discussion and debate about affirmative action is allowed to proceed with the impression that this is about black people, then it will surely be dismantled in every way, shape, and form. And I think that what is happening, and I have been heartened by it, so while this discussion about what the future of civil rights in the 104th Congress is probably one that is not very optimistic, my opinion about the future of civil rights in this country is much more optimistic, but it has less to do with what's going on in the Congress than it has to do with the realization, I think, by many people across this country that, hey, they're talking about me too. And that we are seeing just in the last month, and Boston is probably one of the best examples, a growing coalition of people who historically would have been in different places, realizing that this discussion, for example, about affirmative action is about us, and that we're going to have if we're going to talk about civil rights, then we have to have everyone who is potentially negatively impacted in the room at the same time. So while I don't believe that civil rights has any future in this 104th Congress, or at least the existence and survival of it, if it survives, it will do so because it will happen on the streets of the cities and towns all across this country. And I think that people are beginning to understand that, and some of the stagnation that we saw that kind of gripped people in this whole discussion about welfare reform is wearing off, and so that the discussion about about affirmative action is one that is being engaged in by larger groups of people and certainly larger constituencies. And I think it's the combination of the disaffected and historically disadvantaged and disaffected groups that are coming together around the issue of affirmative action that gives me reason to be optimistic about the survival of civil rights, because we are having this discussion with women, with African Americans, with Hispanics, with people of color, with gays and lesbians, with veterans who have been in contact with us on the state level to say, hey, we're concerned about this too. The disabled community, who understands very well what is going on in Congress and the fact that one of the items on the contract is a dismantling of the ADA, and on the notion, on the explanation that this is simply too costly. And that if you believe that this is about money, and I think that Congressman Frank responded to that point, but I am heartened at the growing coalition that has been born out of this public discussion about the planned dismantling of affirmative action. I think that the coalition is a portent of things to come. So while I do believe that there is no future for the preservation of civil rights as we know it in the 104th Congress, I do think that it will live, because I think that people all across this country recognize that all of the diversity that people are talking about and that we've seen in the articles, and that it didn't come just by magic, that affirmative action played a part in that. And if we think that diversity is something that is welcome and that is valued in this country, then we'll have to continue to talk about some of the same policies that got us to this place as we know it. Do I believe that affirmative action worked in the way it was intended? No. Do I believe that it has been perfect? No. Do I believe that the response or the answer to that is to dismantle in total? No, I do not. Because I think that whatever we like and whatever you think about affirmative action, the reality is, as I think this 104th Congress has proven, sharing and providing equal opportunity for all is not a human nature. It's not a natural reaction, that it is something that most people all across this country do because there is a sense of obligation to do it, that there has historically been a sense of obligation of our responsibility to children, to poor people, to provide housing or health care that is very dangerously in jeopardy of being dismantled by the meanness about the whole discussion, not just about civil rights, but in general, what do we do? And that the bigger message about this discussion of civil rights and affirmative action is the danger that the United States adopts as an official policy a sense that we have absolutely no obligation to people who can't take care of themselves. And not only that, but we also have a right to take what they have, the little bit that they have, and redistribute that opportunity, that wealth, and those resources to other people. I don't believe that Americans are going to let that happen. I don't believe that it's about Republicans. I don't believe that it's about Democrats. And I think that if you look at some of the things that are happening in legislatures all over the country, which are mirroring what's going on in Congress, you'll know Massachusetts has a predominantly Democratic legislature, which stood up in January and extolling the virtues and the pride that they had in the fact that we had adopted one of the toughest welfare reform laws in the country. And so this is, while some people talk about this as Governor Wells' plan, the fact is that 37 out of 40 senators, we only have 9 Republicans. There are only 30 Republicans in the House of Representatives, and the bill passed 135 to 21. And for that reason, I say this is not about Republicans and Democrats. It's about a mentality and a philosophy that has taken over this country where that people are afraid, and that fear is driving them to feel like they have to protect their wealth, and the way they do it is basically to kind of circle the wagons, and all the rest of us are going to be left out. That's the coalition that we have to talk about. People demanded change, and that's clear. But I don't believe that the kind of change that people were talking about was a mandate that we increase the number of poor people that lived in this country. There was never a mandate that I read that said that that's what they were directing the Congress to do or state legislatures all across the country to do. I don't believe that the mandate included an increase in the number of poor people, or that we would adopt policies that would create opportunities to abuse children, to deny women opportunities, the resources to take care of their children. There was no mandate to turn back the progress that we'd made in diversifying our country's institutions, the business, educational institutions, and the like. And there certainly was no mandate that we allow unregulated businesses to poison our streams, our lake, and our water supplies, and the environment. There was no mandate that we ought to be sending women back to dark alleys, and that there certainly was no mandate that people who were different, and whether it's sexual orientation or color, ethnicity, ought to be treated and denied opportunities that everyone else enjoyed. I am looking forward to the opportunity to hear your questions so we can continue this discussion. Thank you.
Good evening. It is certainly a very special moment to be invited to participate in the historic Ford Hall Forum, and it is indeed an honor to be able to share this panel with two outstanding and distinguished public servants, Congressman Frank and Senator Dianne Wilkerson. The danger in going last is all of the points that you intended to make have been already eloquently stated, but that rule has never stopped the law professor from going ahead and saying it anyhow. The perspective that I would like to bring to this topic is an historical one, and one that focuses a lot on race. I believe that the 104th Congress fits into an historical pattern which could have an enormous social and economic ramification for Boston and for this country. What this session of Congress does or does not do will in great part tell us something about the moral underpinnings of this country. And if it chooses to follow a certain path, then an era which many of us read about, we will now have the unfortunate opportunity to witness for ourselves. Studying the history of civil rights in this country makes it crystal clear that there is nothing new under the sun. And the challenge facing this Congress and the challenge facing all of us is, can we learn from the past, or are we condemned to always repeat it? I submit to you that if many of the Republican-sponsored bills become the law of the land in the 104th Congress, we will officially enter the second post-Reconstruction period in America. This country could enter an era that could be as devastating as that of the late 1890s, which was a period of denial and indifference. And some would argue that we could never return to that period because now we have laws on the book that protects the rights of citizens. Let us not forget that there were laws on the books in the 1890s, constitutional amendments, congressional legislation that was intended to protect the rights of all of its citizens, but they didn't make a difference. And the very programs and policies that are presently under attack are the things that have served as a buffer to keep us from fully returning to that period. The civil rights movement of the 1960s attempted to put in place not only laws that would make it illegal to discriminate, but also a pattern of programs and policies that would counterbalance the power, the racism, and the whims of the majority. Affirmative action of the 20th century, like the Freedmen's Bureau of the 19th century, was intended to address the serious injustices that the legal system and the society committed against African people. Yet just as the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1876, which Congress played a tremendous role in, represented the society's official retreat from addressing those injustices and inequities, the 104th Congress could signal a similar retreat from addressing the lasting consequences of slavery, segregation, and dehumanization. The results of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise was to remove federal troops from the South and thus to remove the last arm of protection that newly freed Africans had from white Southern hostility and brutality. The present-day proposals to pass on to the states the ultimate responsibility of administering certain programs for the poor, who are often women and people of color, not only has a similar ring, but could have a similar result. A federal scheme of protection, a federal mandate that reminds Americans of their obligation to be fair, of their obligation to address the wrongs of the century, is still desperately needed. The greatest threat in the 104th Congress to the Civil Rights agenda is the attack on affirmative action and the attack on programs that benefit the poor. Though school lunch programs, WIC, food stamps, and other benefits don't directly fall under the civil rights banner, these programs attempt to provide at the lower end of the economic scale the same checks and balances that affirmative action tries to provide at another level. The civil rights movement was intended to address the direct denial that people faced because of race and eventually gender, yet it was also aimed at addressing the country's persistent problem of poverty and deprivation. And the 104th Congress could serve as a setback to the civil rights movement on both of these fronts and on so many others, as has been indicated by the prior two speakers. There is a recurring theme in America. Meager black advancement is always met with resistance and backlash. It happened in the 1870s and the 1880s, and it's been happening in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. According to Professor Derek Bell, and I quote, "In the 1880s, American society was ripe with social tension. There were cries from the society's lower income echelons for free silver, labor rights, and a graduated income tax. This cry by poor whites for economic rights was appeased through the dismantling of the advances that blacks had made and the creation of the system of segregation. The cries today for economic security and expansion on the part of white males is being appeased by a call for the end to affirmative action and the dismantling of social programs for the poor. Yet, affirmative action is not the thing that is standing in the way of economic prosperity for working class whites. What makes this present reversal and retreat different is that it is coming from Congress and not the Supreme Court or the White House. During the 20th century Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction period, Congress has been an ally to the civil rights movement. When the Supreme Court handed down a series of negative and reactionary civil rights decisions in 1989, including cases like Ward Cove, Patterson versus McLean, and Martin versus Wilkes, the civil rights movement was able to successfully petition Congress to restore those rights taken away by the Supreme Court, and was successful in getting the 1991 Civil Rights Act passed. One should not expect that rights taken away by the 104th Congress will be easily restored by the present Supreme Court. The other major difference between this post-Reconstruction reversal and the prior one is that more than black people will be adversely affected. White women, Latinos, Asians, gays, lesbians, numerous other groups who have benefited from or who have been protected by civil rights laws and affirmative action will also feel the brute force of political retaliation. And maybe it is this threat, maybe it is this reality that will force the beneficiaries of affirmative action to stand up and be counted. If we would all come out of the closet, you would see more than black faces. You would see an entire nation. For everyone here has been a direct or indirect beneficiary of this change in social policy. For it has opened up the society more than anything else has. It has forced us to rethink how we measure excellence, and it has enriched the educational process. If the reversal occurs, what does it mean for Boston? What it means for Boston is a major roadblock towards racial equality, a goal that has often been elusive in the city. It means a less diversified workforce, especially at the top and mid-management level. It would mean fewer black law students and medical students and other graduate students, and fewer students of color in higher education in general. It means fewer resources aimed at addressing the critical needs of the poor, whose civil rights are always the most vulnerable. It means that the constitutional mandate of equality will once again be forestalled in this country. Yes, the society will wake up again in the future and realize that separate but unequal is the practice and custom of the land. The problem, though, is that the problems we have today will only be worse, and those future generations will have to clean up the mess. We must stop this pattern of denial and delay. If the founding fathers of this nation had the moral and political strength to address the contradictions between their declarations and the reality, then a civil war would not have been needed. If Congress and the courts would have resisted the temptation to undercut the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment during the Reconstruction period, then we would not have needed a Selma to Montgomery march, riots in the streets, or a march on Washington. But because it is so much easier to be reactionary than thoughtful, so much easier to be selfish than compassionate, then this society just continues in this pattern of advancement and retreat. Those who resist affirmative action, including some Democrats like Senator Joseph Lieberman from Connecticut, often claim that affirmative action is inconsistent with the moral foundation of this society, inconsistent with the values of this country. And those who make this argument easily forget that for 180 years of the 210-year history of the Constitution, there was no moral foundation of equality. It is only in the last 30 years that this country has attempted to live up to the values that are being professed. There is no deep moral well of equality for this country to tap into. It is very misleading to argue that affirmative action deviates from some long-standing practice and value. If all it takes for a society and for a person to have values is to profess them but not to live by them, then values are meaningless. The period that we are in has been this country's most concerted attempt to develop values of equality and justice. But we must realize that equity is a forerunner to equality, just as justice is a prerequisite to peace. And those values cannot be developed in a vacuum under some facade of color blindness, which this country has never known. Senator Dole, in explaining his reservations about affirmative action, stated, and I quote, "Slavery was wrong, but should future generations have to pay for that?" If it all stopped with slavery, Senator Dole, that would be one thing. But it is the nearly 100 years after slavery where this country, either through its laws or practices, subjugated African Americans into a state of second-class citizens. And yes, some of us may want to wipe that reality from our minds, as Senator Dole did, but that doesn't change the history. There are those of us living today who lived under those segregated and dehumanizing systems and signs. And there are those living today who were the prime beneficiaries and defenders of that system. And Senator Jesse Helm, the person who is sponsoring the so-called Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1995, which attempts to make affirmative action unconstitutional, fits squarely in that category. But he is not alone, for this is not a problem of the ancient past. This is a problem of contemporary America. I know as a society, some may be tired of being reminded of this history over and over again, but eliminating affirmative action will not silence the voices. It will only make them louder and angrier, and more importantly, it will certainly make the situation worse. The 104th Congress faces the moral dilemma that many have faced before. If it it can fall into the trap of doing what it thinks is expedient in order to be reelected, in order to continue to manipulate the passions of vulnerable and scared people, or it can take a true moral high ground and try to enlighten the populace about the real challenges that face us. I know that there are those who may feel that affirmative action is the reason that we are divided as a nation and that welfare is the cause of persistent poverty, but nothing could be farther from the truth. We are divided because throughout the history of this country, Congress, the White House, and the Supreme Court have never found the moral and political will to seriously and consistently address the problem of racism and its consequences. There has always been those willing to offer up the rights of black and poor people in order to address the perceived and real challenges of economic hard times. And we have once again come face to face with this dilemma. And the question is, will history repeat itself? I will close at this historic Forward Hall Forum with the words of Thaddeus Stevens, the congressman from Pennsylvania who fought so hard to get Congress to pass legislation which would provide each freed African with 40 acres and a mule. After realizing his proposal would not be adopted, he stated, and I quote, "I had fondly dreamed that when any fortunate chance should have broken up for a while the foundation of our institutions, that we would have so remodeled all of our institutions as to have freed them of every vestige of human oppression and of every vestige of inequality of rights. This bright dream has vanished like the baseless fabric of a vision." If he was alive a century later, he would witness the same pattern and would have the same disappointment. And if the 104th Congress is not careful in its deliberation, then someone will be forced to repeat these same words from the floor of Congress. History is the lens through which we must observe this 104th Congress, and only time and history will tell us if we have learned from the past or whether we are again condemned to repeat it. Thank you.